Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have the final Nova Scotia 2024 election forecast. Now, before I begin, I'd like to once again shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel. You make a lot of this possible, and if anyone else wants to make my work easier or have more throughput possibly in the future, by all means, go down to the link in the description below and press that join button. Every little bit helps. But otherwise, just do your regular YouTube things. Like, share, subscribe, and comment below. But with that, let us begin. So the Nova Scotia election is winding down here. We're getting into the point here where it's looking like we might see actually quite a low turnout election as people seem to be realizing that the PCs are pretty much set to win no matter what happens. So a lot of voters seem unlikely to turn out. Now, that may or may not be true. That may or may not actually occur, because sometimes these projections of low turnout don't always turn out to be true. But in this particular instance, it does seem to be the case. As we can see here on this map, there's really nowhere left in the province for the NSLP. They just have the riding of Sydney-Membertou, and that's it. They got nothing else. There are former southern exurbs of Halifax, such as the Timberley Prospect area, Halifax Atlantic area. Though Halifax Atlantic actually has quite a bit of suburban growth in this particular region right up here. But generally speaking, there's not. That's more of an exurban part of the county. That's gone now. They have a little bit of a hope in Annapolis, but not much. And Yarmouth, they're distant. Or, sorry, a little way back. About 3-4 points. So again, theoretically, 4-seat win could happen. Pulling out of 4 seats for the Liberals could happen. It's still a possibility, but it's getting very unlikely. Inside suburban Halifax, when you look at Fairview, well, that's more anyways, like Fairviews and Clayton Parks and Bedfords, Cole Harbors, that's gone. The Liberals are so distant, it's not even worth considering. But things aren't really much better for the NDP. This entire election, and all they've really done is snipe Halifax, Chebucto, and Fairview Clayton Park from the dying Liberal Party. That's all they've gained. They haven't gained seats or ground vis-a-vis the PCs. They have just gained some votes from the Liberals. And that's not a comfortable position to be in if you're Claudia Chender. Because a lot of those voters might just be voting NDP right now because they're not very enthused by Zach Churchill, who's not well liked, not very popular, kind of a wet noodle when it comes to charisma. So a better, stronger, more eloquent, more charismatic leader for the Liberals, a lot of these people could come back. So we could see 2028 might be a battle for suburban Halifax kind of thing. Maybe come with these rural ridings. But for this election, this cycle, it's over. The only question here on election night is what lead, how big of a lead will Houston have? How many seats is he going to win? And it's actually kind of at this kind of interesting point in election forecasting where, in my opinion, it's actually harder when it's close to a sweep like this than when it's more set and competitive. And the reason for that is since we have 3 parties here, the Liberals, NDP, and the PCs, weird asymmetric differences in how these parties are voting could change a lot. Because a lot of the polls just lump Halifax Metro, maybe the whole county of Halifax, maybe Cape Breton, and then the rest of Nova Scotia. A lot of polls are just Halifax and the rest of Nova Scotia. So weird differences in this particular incumbent is very popular, or that one is not, or this candidate sucks, can really change a lot of these things quite rapidly. Now, none of these are going to change the winner. Houston is going to win, but in a sense, I think there's actually more uncertainty with the projection. The margin of errors are higher because it's such a dominant position. And it's, again, this isn't like, say, Saskatchewan. Well, I did very well in Saskatchewan. And I'm going to do a postmortem in the future, probably Friday, but we'll see. But saying it's something like Saskatchewan, it's two parties. It's, for the most part, it's pretty set. You're not seeing mass defections. In this election, the Liberals have lost half their voters, give or take. Maybe we could say 40% of their voters. But a bunch of them have won to the PCs. A bunch have won to the NDP. And that changes things a lot. Where did they lose these voters? Where did they gain voters? The easy assumption is they lost NDP voters to the NDP in, say, Halifax, Chebucto, Fairview, Clayton Park. And they gained voters, lost voters to the PCs in the rural parts of the province. Sure, that probably did happen, but again, the smoothness factor here is not necessarily set. Now, I'm not expecting to do particularly bad on this election when it comes to hit rate. I'm expecting north of 90%, but we might not see something as high as, say, I got in Saskatchewan or I got in the US recently. Even though this election is pretty easy to forecast. Just because there's so much uncertainties because the Liberal vote is collapsing. If it collapses uniformly, like my model assumes, then I should get this close to 100%. But it's not a uniform collapse. If there's some incumbents who are just really strong and they hold on in spite of everything else, things can be different. And this would not be the first time my model has had issues with this, such as Quebec in 2022, or not so much my model per se, but you see this in Manitoba, where the Manitoba Liberals all but collapsed, but one particular incumbent is very strong and held on. So there's a lot of uncertainties here when a relatively large party collapses in an election cycle. But, again, just to emphasize here, Houston is going to win. Even if we chalk up the maximum uncertainties on this. There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ridings that he could lose without me really just missing the election completely. Just a complete, a complete and total miss. Even if he loses all 6 to the NDP, which is impossible, by the way, but let's say he does. It's only 14 to 39. That's still a stomping majority. And part of this, too, really does seem to be vindicated in how the different parties are acting. The NDP have pretty much run a Halifax-only platform. The Liberals have run a pretty much Halifax-only platform. Now, the Liberals have a little more stuff that the rest of the province might care about, but a lot of it, like the free transit promise, rebuild or expanding the McKay Bridge, that's more Halifax-centric. Now, is that good or bad? That's a whole other thing altogether. But I think because you're seeing Halifax-centric promises like that for a lot of this stuff, especially all the transit proposals, what you're really seeing is the Liberals and the NDP are trying to hold out their base because they don't think they can beat Houston in the rest of the province. But that actually leads to a very interesting question here, and I think this is the main question I'm going to touch on in this video, is what goes from here? Now, I'll update this topic when I go to the postmortem for Nova Scotia, when we actually have the final election results. But right now, what we can see here before Election Day, what happens after the 26th? Which, by the way, Election day is 26. Polls are open 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Check Elections Nova Scotia for your local polling office. There were not voter cards issued this year because of the mail strike. So they could not mail them out. So make sure you check Elections Nova Scotia website for your polling precinct. Where to go to vote. But back to the main topic. Where does it go from here? Well, you obviously have the first order consideration. Does Houston do a good job or not? That's always the most important one, because if Houston does a terrible job for the next 4 years, he's probably going to lose. Now, it might seem, oh, he has a 23-point lead, how could he lose? We do this all the time in Nova Scotia. Darrell Dexter had an 18-point lead. He lost the next election. The Liberals had a quite strong lead after 2017. They lost 2021. Having a very large popular vote lead doesn't matter that much because for the most part, the PCs and Liberals are pretty close together. And while the NDP have moved quite a bit in the last 3 cycles since Darrell Dexter, they're still close enough that voters will move between the parties. Especially the more centrist-y type voters. So the right platform, the right leader combination, plus a really bad incumbent, things can change. People can move very rapidly. Or just stay home. Which is a possibility. But if we assume that Houston continues as is, he's not better, he's not worse. So in other words, the economy is going fine relative to Canada. The housing market is going fine relative to population growth and relative to Canada. Because the housing market is awful in Nova Scotia, but our population growth is extremely high. So, it is what it is. No one wants to reduce population growth in the province, so it is what it is. Etc. If those things are fine, Houston will almost certainly be fine in 2028. He might even be fine going into 2032, assuming, again, he does a fine job. Now, a lot of these times, especially in government, you're not actually electing someone for their platform. You're electing someone to handle the unforeseeable, unknowable events that might happen in the next 4 years. So, one of these unforeseeable, unknowable events in the next 4 years could completely torpedo the PCs. I think a large part of why the PCs won in 2021 was after effects caused by the pandemic. One such after effect being Stephen McNeil resigning. If he stayed in office, I think the Liberals probably would have won. Maybe a minority, but they probably would have won. So things can happen. Even if the party does its best job, and a reasonably good job, handling a crisis, the crisis can cause enough collateral damage that people want a new government anyways. The voters are fickle. But let's assume we're not having a major crisis. We're not going to see Tim Houston govern dramatically differently in the next term. Or the next 2 terms. Okay? What are we left with? Well, the NDP will almost certainly keep Claudia Chender. The NDP is not known for replacing leaders on a rapid basis. Gary Burrell got 2 terms, or 2 attempts. Darrell Dexter got several attempts. I don't recall how many. I think it was like 2 or 3. And he ended up winning one of them. Federally, Singh's had 3. Before that, Jack Layton had like 5 or something like that. So the NDP are known to keep leaders on for a very long time. And in this case, since Claudia Chender will probably win them 2 more seats, will probably win them more vote share. Unless she personally wants to leave, she's almost certainly going to stay as the leader of the NDP. And I think that is actually really bad for the NDP. Claudia Chender really does not have much appeal outside of Metro, outside of Halifax area. And there really isn't much chance for that to change. Maybe she could run a very different platform. Maybe she could do different things. But as her name recognition slowly creeps up, that'll be very difficult. Now, the plus for Claudia Chender is she does actually try to oppose Tim Houston, but she just picks the things that are the worst things to oppose Tim Houston on, such as rent control. Her rent control proposals are wild. They're very, very radical. They would essentially destroy the capacity. No one would ever make a new rental in Nova Scotia, probably, if she put those policies in. Rent cap at, I believe it was 2.5%, off the top of my head, and no fixed-term leases. Almost no new rentals would ever be made in the province. Fixed-term leases are basically the only way landlords can try to evict tenants. And you might say, oh, evicting tenants, that's not good. But the fixed term is like, this is a 5-year lease, and then you're done, kind of thing. But if it's month by month auto-renewing, i.e. no fixed term, it's almost impossible to evict a renter. And then you add very low rent increases, probably below inflation, in fact. No one's going to do it. No one will ever do it. There's no point. But I digress. She has a big issue that she's very tied to Halifax-based issues, and her platform, which I touched on in the previous video, really doesn't cover anything that matters to the rest of the province. A lot of the stuff is very, very Halifax-centric. Or it's just what Tim Houston is already promising to do or already has been doing. So the things that she's opposing Houston on, which the opposition needs to do, are not things that really matter to almost the entire province. So there's not much path. She's already winning, if she wins these 8, will have won almost all the ridings that have majority renters. There's not much more to go from there. But then we get to the NSLP. And here, there's an interesting decision, an interesting strategic possibility. So, obviously, when you're looking at, say, like a 2025 or 2026 leadership race, there's a whole host of things that could be happening. It's really hard to say for certain who will run, especially depending on when the race is announced. For the NSLP, if they're smart, they will wait to have the leadership race until after the federal election, because I strongly suspect their best options... Well, actually, maybe the people will be happy to resign. That's an interesting consideration. But I digress. The best options for the NSLP will likely be current federal Liberal MPs. And there's 2 in mind for me. First one is Sean Fraser. He's more high profile than many of the Liberal MPs in Nova Scotia. His favorability in Nova Scotia is relatively good. It's not like astounding, but relatively good. And he has the capacity to come in and talk about his changes vis-a-vis housing as a federal minister, as trying to have a talking point, as a base point to try to critique or push back on Houston. And his big negatives being his immigration policies, Houston will never attack, because Houston supports that. So that's a pretty strong option there. High profile, relatively high name ID, and he's a relatively good talker, which is one of Zach Churchill's big issues, is he's not very good at talking. He's not very interesting to listen to. Sean Fraser is much more interesting to listen to. But the other one, because of the one big issue that Sean Fraser has, I'll just say, is he would be running, presumably, near where he lives, which is Antigonish area. And needless to say, Antigonish is very deep blue right now. Now, that could change. Obviously, the Liberals have won Antigonish provincially before. But it's a pretty hard cup of tea to sell for someone like Sean Fraser to say, hey, do you want to burn a couple years of your life running in provincial politics when you have a very high probability of losing your own seat even if you win the election? Sure, he could jump off to a different part of the province, run Annapolis or something. But usually people don't like doing that. People usually like trying to run where they're from. And voters usually like that as well. Then the other big one that I can think of right now would be Cody Blois. Blois? I'm really bad at names, in case you haven't gotten it up before. But he's the current MP for King's Hants. Now, he's almost certainly going to lose as well, federally, in the next election, which is one of the reasons why he might try to jump ship for the NSLP leadership. But he comes, despite being likely to lose federally, relatively popular. He's probably, of the MPs in Nova Scotia that the Liberals have, who are incumbents and going to lose, he's probably the most well-liked of them. He has a very distinct base in, say, Hants County. But his big issue, versus, say, Sean Fraser, is he has very low name ID. Many of you watching this video will probably never have heard of him before. But as a leader of the NSLP, I think he has a very good shot of actually winning a bunch of seats that the Liberals do need to win a government. Doesn't matter how many seats you win in Halifax. You can't form government with just Halifax. There's just not enough seats. So you need to win rural seats. And I think there is a decent possibility he could, say, win East Hants, where he's from. Or he could win back Annapolis. Maybe Yarmouth. That kind of rural ridings that are close to the Liberals already, that they're running in a decent position, and they could probably be able to win back. But, again, remains to be seen. Maybe he could do even better in, say, Kings or Hants West, but it depends. There is a bunch of headwinds, though. Namely, again, the lack of name recognition. I don't know if he would play as well in Halifax City proper. So he might be the kind of leader that can win more seats for the Liberal Party, buying them more time to rebuild. But he might not be the leader capable of actually winning an election. Because for the PCs, the path to winning is to win the rural areas in maybe some Halifax suburbs and or exurbs. For the Liberals, the path to winning is to win the Halifax suburbs and or exurbs, and then win some rural ridings. I don't know, in this current day and age, 2024, we're looking into 2028, if a rural-based MP, or MLA even, a leader, is going to actually be able to do that, which is, I think, one of the big issues you have with the two parties trying to oppose the PCs, is there's a lot of dissatisfaction between Metro and the rest of the province, and also Cape Breton and the rest of the province, but we're going to just ignore the Cape Breton problem for now, because Cape Breton's kind of like, I'm really oversimplifying this here, so if you're from Cape Breton, don't read too wrong into this, but Cape Breton kind of plays very similar to Nova Scotia, but smaller. That makes sense. So rural Cape Breton versus Sydney area. Again, it's not a perfect 1-to-1, but there's an analogy there. But again, rural Cape Breton does vote more like rural Nova Scotia than it does anything else. So again, it's reasonably close. But a lot of people in Halifax Metro think that the province spends way too much resources in the rural areas. They do not provide a proportional amount of services to Halifax. They don't really care about Halifax's issues as much, things such as family doctor shortages and traffic being two really big ones that a lot of Haligonians think the provincial government doesn't focus enough on. But then you go into rural parts of the province, and people think, the feds or the province spends way too much money in Halifax, and they don't spend enough money on the rest of the province, or they don't care about the rest of the province, because, again, the rest of the province in a lot of cases is a lot poorer, especially some counties, like I believe, I can't remember off the top of my head, I don't want to actually name the wrong county, but some of the rural counties are quite very, very poor. Meanwhile, Halifax is, relatively speaking, a wealthy city, so especially when you look at the suburbs and or exurbs of Halifax. So there is a lot of animosity there, and I think it'd be very difficult right now for a party to win both simultaneously, unless you're talking about something like Tim Houston here, who's winning both largely because of vote splitting. If you combined the Liberals and the NDP together, most of Halifax would go to them. You're looking at Cole Harbour, Bedford, I guess point that out here. Cole Harbour, Preston, Bedfords, Clayton Park, Timberley, Halifax Atlantic, like all of those would probably go to a combined Liberal NDP party. Now, Houston would be getting well north of 50% of the vote in that case. He would might even get north of 60% of the vote in that case. But you'd still be looking at 37-ish% probably going to this combined party. And they'd win most of Halifax suburbs. So, again, you have this tricky dichotomy. And this isn't just a unique thing to Nova Scotia. You see this in Saskatchewan. You see this in Manitoba. You see this in Alberta. You see this in BC. You see this federally. You see this in America. You see this in the UK. You see this in France, etc. Every Western country is getting along this kind of rural-urban polarization. And a lot of the issues I just said, while very unique to Nova Scotia in their exact specificities, are not uncommon globally. The exact kind of discontent between the two of them. Cities think because they're richer and wealth is essentially being redistributed to the poorer areas that this is unfair. And the poorer areas think the cities are richer and we're poorer, that's not fair. That's really, really wildly oversimplifying it. But that's kind of what ends up being. Or you also have another consideration too, which is the cities want to ban things that they don't like, but then they're banning things that people in rural areas want to have, guns being a really common strike stone on that. People living in rural areas are much more used to being around guns, have much higher need for guns, and just use them more. People in cities, very less that. So again, you have all sorts of complexities here. Nothing is ever simple, and nothing is ever constant or static either. The problems we're talking about right now might not be problems in 20 years, 10 years even. But for the next cycle, next 2 cycles, they will be problems. And they are problems that the parties will have to deal with. So, in a sense, for the Liberals or the NDP, they want to actually beat Tim Houston right now in the year of our Lord 2024, well, 2028 really. They need to try to find a platform/leader combination that can bridge the gap between Halifax Metro and the rest of the province. And that's non-trivial. And the thing that makes it even harder is that different parts of the province are very different, obviously, because they're different parts of the province, but, that needs to go without saying. Just saying the rest of Nova Scotia is a wild oversimplification. Some of these ridings are very different. Or some of these counties, I should say. So, for example, the South Shore is very different to Cape Breton. it's very different to the North Shore, which I think next time I'll do this, I'll probably merge these two into North Shore. I'm not sure if these are useful distinguishing categories. And then Annapolis Valley itself is once again a very different place. You can see here just in voting, the votes are very different. The two Central Nova / Fundy Northeast and South Shore, the Conservatives do really well. The Liberals do terrible. The NDP do terrible. But the Annapolis Valley and Cape Breton, it's a very different thing. So it's, again, these things are complicated. They're not trivial. And just to give some illustrations, the South Shore, the jurisdiction I'm talking about is this, but usually these are considered in the South Shore. I think for the next cycle, I might jump all this together. Now, almost no polls actually break out the South Shore region. So me lumping it however I want to lump it is fine. Doesn't actually matter. But I might lump it later differently. But for this cycle, I didn't want to change anything. Didn't have time. But generally speaking, this area, it's big on fishing. It's big on lobster fishery in particular. And there's a lot of concerns and angst about the fishery that the federal libs are basically just destroying. That's the fear. Is it true? I don't know. But a lot of people in this area, these lobster fishing communities, these fishing communities, are very paranoid about this because obviously we've all seen the cod collapse. And when you start hearing about mass illegal fishing of lobsters, especially out of season, people get very uneasy about that. And then you look at, say, Annapolis Valley area, usually generally considered this part. What does that area look like? Well, it's very heavily into farming communities, but unlike the kind of farming you might see in Saskatchewan or Alberta, where the farmers there overwhelmingly vote conservative. Some parts of rural Alberta could be 80% conservative in farming communities. The Annapolis Valley is very different. Part of it is demographics, part of it is age. Old Nova Scotians are much more, quote-unquote, ideologically liberal than young Nova Scotians. Polls keep showing this too. So, the Annapolis Valley is relatively old compared to the province. I mean, all the rural areas are, duh. But in particular, the kind of people living in the Annapolis Valley tend to be more ideologically liberal than the rest of the province. And the actual provincial Liberal Party is kind of like the soft, right liberal kind of party that a lot of farmer types do actually like. And there's other communities too in the Annapolis Valley region. It's not just farmers, obviously. But that kind of demographic policies play better in this region than, say, the South Shore. Then the North Shore, it's more mining, it's more industrial, or at least it has been. A lot of times, places like New Glasgow are kind of almost post-industrial nowadays. And also post-mining in some senses. Part of the reason why much of rural Nova Scotia can be quite poor is because of that kind of stuff. But again, these regions are different. Cape Breton obviously is very different itself. I don't really feel comfortable describing how it's different, but if you're from the province, you know it's different. If you're from Cape Breton, you also know it's different. A lot of Cape Bretoners don't like being associated with the rest of Nova Scotia. It is what it is. So, trying to just win rural is not trivial. It's not as simple as saying the three categories of Halifax, which is the urban, rural, suburban, exurban. It's more complicated than that. You could break it down to the four if you really want, if you want to talk about, outer versus inner core, but that's not as important right now. So these things are difficult, and there's not really a clear path for either Liberal or NDP to try to do this. It's possible. Weirder things have happened. But I think barring Houston really screwing up, or a major disaster happening, or maybe a once-in-a-generation unicorn candidate, it's hard to see how things are really going to change. At best, you might see some seats get eroded. In a sense, I think Nova Scotia is very much going to be falling into kind of like Ontario status quo with Doug Ford. Is Doug Ford just the strongest, most powerful person ever? No. Is he the best premier ever? No. But he has a coalition behind him that is very difficult to oppose. It's very difficult for the Liberals or the NDP to really attack this coalition in any meaningful fashion. And that's going to be this. It seems to be coming true in Nova Scotia as well. Which then, if you remember my thesis from my last Canada video, where the results of who wins between the NDP and the Liberals in Ontario and Nova Scotia, it might be a very long time before we know who wins. Because it's not clear who should be able to win in either of these provinces. But only time will tell. Maybe the population growth is the only way to tell, but for now, I'll call it here. If you like this video, remember, like, share, subscribe, comment below, and make sure you go out and vote tomorrow. But with that, I bid you guys all adieu, and I'll see you next time with something else.